So this presentation contains a certain amount of drugs. I didn't actually have time to count them, so you might have to do that for me. It also contains one very important tangerine and an undisclosed quantity and quality of metaphors and 10 micrograms of apostrophes. So, a word of warning, I'm going to be a bit scientific in a moment, but I'm also going to introduce some reassuringly disparate themes. And then what I'm hopefully going to do is weave them all together. And the metaphor that I'm going to use to do this is called the fabric of consciousness. And it's a really ubiquitous metaphor that you will have encountered probably multiple times in this conference because it's very often used in psychology. So we piece together a narrative, or we explore the rich seams between different strands of dialogue, or we tailor an argument, we follow a thread. And I promise that you will start seeing these material metaphors absolutely everywhere when you follow your thread of life out of this room. And all of these attendant metaphors to the fabric of consciousness, they come from fabric, from the Latin fabrica, and that is that which is made, something skillfully produced, and later a word that has been claimed enduringly by the textile industry. And it's my contention that a lot more skill goes into producing the media we consume, the media that feeds our heads, than into necessarily interpreting it and bringing attention to how we absorb it. And this is a balance that I am confident that it is possible to redress. But given all the pesticides and nitrates and vested interests and subliminal frames and subtexts and often toxic but not necessarily toxic elements that come into the constant inescapable swirl of media that we live in, I'd like to offer you a fine piece of gauze for your receptors, a metaphorical sieve, so that you can see all of these additional contexts and filter them and take stock of the counter-narratives and extenuating circumstances and obfuscated individuals who are screaming to get out of the oubliette that media coverage leaves them in when they put them on the cutting room floor. And what I ask you before I do this is this the Emperor's new clothes? Am I really giving you this sieve? Well, I promise that it's no more the Emperor's new clothes than any of the advertising for prescription amphetamines that has full glossy pages in mainstream print media in the US. And what I mean by the Emperor's new clothes is an idea of collective myopia, when we're so focused on the basketball game that we miss the gorillas, and we're so focused on ADHD that we feel like it's this condition that just means we forget to concentrate. And there's a pill for that, by the way, but we don't consider any of the other symptoms. We don't consider emotional dysregulation, insomnia, joint pain. And we're so guided to perceive amphetamines as a necessary remedy that we don't focus on any of the counter effects. We don't focus on loss of appetite, insomnia again, irritability. And of course, exactly the same myopia goes on in propaganda against methamphetamine, though in this context with vilification instead of valorization and context-dependent vilification, which is a real shame because neuroscientist Dr. Carl Hart describes this as essentially the same drug. So what's different? It's the text and the context. But without further ado, I would like to introduce the tangerine. So constructing this talk has been a bit like a Rubik's Cube. There's been so many different strands that I've been hoping to get in, and whatever pattern I've tried out, I've realized that the one thing I'll regret doing is leaving out the tangerine, which was handed to me in London about 2 years ago, when I was escaping to Mexico in the middle of lockdown in March 2021. And as the Uber driver dropped me off at an eerily empty Heathrow, where there was no teary-eyed snogging, no stag do's, he gave me this tangerine and another for the road. And that's when I really knew that I was getting on that plane. And so I ate the tangerine about a week later on the beach, and I shared it with some friends. And by that time, it looked kind of like me, of London but displaced and probably haggard rather than acclimatized. And I handed it to the group. And one of my best friends, who I've known for years, was there, but there were also some new faces. There was someone from Mexico City, there was someone from Chicago, which is where we were, someone from the Netherlands, someone from Peru. And as we chewed these shriveled segments, I played this game in my head, which I often play when I'm tripping, which is from Julian Vane's Getting Higher. And I really like this activity because your mind goes to some really unexpected places when you're playing it. And so I thought about where the Tangerine had come from and this trail of people that had been involved in this moment where we were eating it on the beach. So there's the pickers, there's the packers, there's the transporters, there's the vendors, there's your housemate. In my case, there was the taxi driver, and then all of these people on the beach. And as we chewed on this piece of fruit transplanted from London to Mexico, I thought about whether it might have come from Spain or South Africa originally, and about the taxi driver and where he'd picked it up from, and whether he gave all of his customers 2 tangerines, and if he did that every morning, and what other places he was going to, and what had brought everyone there to that beach in that moment. And where I'm going with this, and why I felt like it was so crucial to mention this tangerine that I ate 2 years ago at Breaking Convention today, is that what had once been a static object became this live web of energies and agencies and stories that endures beyond the tangerine itself, which is an example of what the philosopher Jane Bennett would call vibrant matter. And it's live webs like these that are there even if we can't necessarily see them, that are the context that endures even if you take the text out of focus in media terms, that this presentation is going to focus on today, and on what happens when that's where we train our attention on these invisible elements. So I'm not going to show you all the drugs that I didn't count, but here are all the apostrophes that this presentation contains. So I've put them in this Petri dish because that's what you do when you want to become familiar with the workings of something in the material realm. I think that's what we call science. You explore the component parts. And so I've isolated these apostrophes with no comment on their minimum levels of THC. And these are just one element of the complex technology called language that underwrites the human experience. And look at how nervously they're quivering as they stick to the side. They look a bit like visual snow, which is what happens when you consult a physicist. Matt Smart is the physicist that advised me on how to get these apostrophes. They look a bit like physical snow because they've been pulled from a 2D to a 3D realm. And I brought them along like this today to emphasize the tension between the validity of isolating and examining something in its component parts, like the parts of a text or indeed an experience, and the need to remember when we do this, the organism that they are then missing and missing from, the context and the multiple overlapping systems which the component has then been shorn of. Because the component parts of a text are only actually so effective up to a point when they're decontextualized. So these apostrophes are here to illustrate that we can zero in on punctuation and we can look up individual words, but we cannot get away from the fact that when all of the different elements unite in our experience of a piece of media, there is an entourage effect, exactly like with cannabinoids, when all of the ingredients combine and they make up something that's greater than the sum of all of their component parts. So we are going to leave the apostrophes for now, but we will need them later. And in a moment, I have a word of warning from my Semantric Sessions co-host, Dr. Rhiannon Crane. So you may have noticed that I described the media as carrying these agencies and energies. And one of the ways that it carries the energies and agencies it infuses us with in the metaphors it in the metaphors it contains, a literary device specially for carrying concepts from one context to another in the context of text. And A bit like drugs, you can do this clunkily. So obviously, like liquid cocaine in football shirts, the process increases the weight of the garment by 15%, but this can be reversed in a lab without losing a single gram. But this doesn't always go unnoticed by customs officials. And just like carrying across a substance in text, there's more sophisticated methods of carrying across substances that employ more sophisticated systems and more systems. And the technologist David Orban describes weaving as a better metaphor for Bitcoin instead of mining, saying weavers take intertwined threads through their expert value-added activity to create a strong fabric, which is exactly what blockchain does. But Rhiann's PhD is devoted in part to exploring alternatives to some of the clunkier metaphors that would definitely get stopped at an airport if they were being scanned for stagnant ideas or dogmas or literary merit. Metaphors that are so pervasive in psychedelic discourse, like the brain reset or 10 years of therapy in one night or it's no silver bullet. And what she cautions against, what we discuss a lot in the weekly discussions we host, is the danger in psychedelic wellness culture of being peddled these shiny new metaphors and the chance to reframe your story without pushing for a deeper consciousness to the process of reframing the systems on which you run the narratives. And this means that your shiny new metaphors are just going to calcify ultimately, like the ones that you went to the retreat to unshackle yourself from in the first place. And it's the inner processing of language that enables you to effectively unshackle yourself autonomously. And this is what we want to provide the skills for free for yourself in the Semantric sessions. That this is why we wanted to facilitate what we decided to set up. And every speaker we invite helps us with bringing different aspects of psychedelia into focus to help us do this. So what's necessary for unpacking the hidden dogmas in the media that we consume? Well, it's making the visible invisible. It's what I referred to briefly before, the invisible gorilla. There's this really famous experiment, Chris Chablis and Daniel Simons from Harvard, and it's basically a basketball game where people watch it and their attention is so trained on the players that they don't notice that there's a person in a gorilla suit moving through the pitch, and that's because that's not where their attention is focused. And this is what's going on most of the time when we engage with media. Our attention is drawn to particular parts of the storyline, underscored again with the textual elements of its visual media, and it's all done with really high quality storytelling techniques designed to make it as easy to absorb as possible. And while we're absorbed, we miss all the guerrilla forces acting on our psyches, influencing how we feel, our stress levels, the way we think, what we think about. And someone who doesn't let any of these forces get away with staying invisible is Cassia Urbaniak, who trained as a Taoist nun while working as one of the world's most successful dominatrixes in the world to fund her studies. And Urbaniak sits at this really interesting nexus of human experience and uses these very attuned and rarefied ways of engaging with what's around her to reveal the hidden levers and pulleys behind patriarchal mechanisms that dictate much of social interaction still, in order to offer emancipation from that which can only be liberated from by being seen. And in doing so, in drawing on these ideas of the invisible gorilla and making what's invisible visible, I hope to draw attention to some of the ways in which uncritical media consumption can result in attentional blindness, in an accidental myopia that can come from focusing too obediently on what's ostensibly there. And the more invisible systems we see, the more we can see them in relation to the media consumed, the situations we find ourselves in. And so then you're much less likely to end up on a psychedelic retreat where the web designer or brand strategist is more deeply learned than any of the other members of the team, where the kinds of discernment that making invisible systems more visible bring you in relation to media can leave you means that once you're actually in a ceremony context, you can understand all the modalities that ought to be there or not, and things like covert abuse and power dynamics that enable you to then distinguish between hierarchies and traditions that you might expect to encounter in this potentially unfamiliar context you find yourself in, versus toxic dynamics between the facilitators that you should run a mile from. And in the case of the media, to be able to see more of these invisible forces at play, shimmering around a drugs article, for example, might actually save your life. And it will also improve your wider community, because by misleading the public about drug culture and drug safety practices, media is directly increasing the stigma that drives punitive drug policies, causes preventable deaths. And while it's the communities who are already most marginalized who are also awfully most affected by all of this, the whole of society bears the brunt and the consequences, as we all upheld the status quo by perpetuating news articles, sharing them unconsciously in ways that harm everyone. And the more clear this becomes, the more we look at who is spinning the yarns and why, rather than pulling the wool even further over our eyes, the easier it is to avoid unwittingly upholding the status quo, unconsciously imbibed from the media that we consume. And as we familiarize ourselves with the different forms of media and how they work and how they interact with us and our relationships, not only with drugs, but with our regular neurotransmitters, we can become adroit movers through this maelstrom rather than ending up a captive audience or the captive consumers of the substances advertised to us, working and playing and paying for someone else's vision of when and how and where and why we experience altered states of consciousness. Now, to explore media as it weaves its way into our lives and how it shapes them, the idea of fabric, that which has been made, is woven into how we conceptualize life itself. In ancient Greece, the understanding of life was that Clotho would spin the thread of life and Lachesis would cut it, and Atropos would decide when to make the cut. So we are all alive as we follow this thread which connects everything we have ever been before to everything right now, this through line to everything we're going to be, and that's why we have the right constantly to change our perspectives on our experiences. It's informed by new experiences, new perception. And as we weave together, we stitch, we patch, we piece together all textiling terms. Even the word text itself, from the Latin texere, means that which is woven, is cut from the same cloth. Of course, you do get ubiquitous metaphors from other crafts too, like to join, which is from carpentry, or to paint a picture, but ultimately all of these things are using material, and if you decide it's not relevant, then it's immaterial. So the making of context is like the making of textiles, in that the making of the activity itself is intrinsic to what you end up making, and knitting produces something knitted, weaving produces something woven, patching together a narrative results in the sense that there might be missing pieces, there might be missing parts, and all context, all consciousness are inseparable from the elements that craft, that inspire, that flavor, that produce them, and the context will never stop evolving, being made, for as long as there is consciousness to make it. And this perhaps accounts for the prevalence of material metaphors in culture and the tapestry that we cannot stop thickening as thinking thickens it. And what we're going to look at today, if we have time, is the intersection between the fabric of consciousness and the forces shaping the context around us, and the sprawling, ever-updating making of documentary on consciousness that we are in. And to do this, we need to understand the activities and the impetus behind the different kinds of media created, and before we consider what happens when they reach our minds. The best way to do that is to think about spinning yarns and where and why and how they're being spun, and not to vivisect texts that have been shorn of their context. The context, a word from the 1540s, which also means the weaving together of words in language, from the Latin contexere, which also comes from the textile industry. Separately, and then of course together, all of the component parts of a text can be agents of change. So what we're going to explore is how we can start to tune into the agencies moving through and round a text that change the context it was birthed into, and how they manifest in the text themselves as the words on the page, with all of their connotations and implications as the agents of change, and what it is to change our consciousness in relation to the media we encounter. reframing is when our sense of our consciousness goes deeper and we add a new element of complexity to that which was previously there, and another thread. And that's the point at which that which had previously been invisible becomes visible. The tapestry gets thicker, perhaps as we add in an understanding of power dynamics to what we know about consent or about financial relationships, to what we understand about the intersection of the pharmaceutical industry and politics and the media. And when we add in this knowledge, there's a new kind of thread in the weave. And it's only on reframing that our previous headspace, our mindscape, our mental landscape seems to develop a framework that we can make out. And what was previously fungible, the ideas you absorbed in the media you consumed without registering you were doing this, is suddenly made consciously tangible. And see, only on reframing this experience and not on experiencing in the first place that this happens, because this happens in the moment you are in now, with apologies to Eckhart Tolle, the absolute frontier of your consciousness. Apologies that are moving into liquid crystal pixels as we speak, because this presentation is being recorded and turning into the media that you're watching now. Sorry again. And your current headspace, that's always serving as your fulcrum for orientation. And it's essential that you can't stand to the side and appraise this moment of perspective at the moment of perception, because you can't have a reflection on something that hasn't been reflected yet. So when we consciously reframe, this is the fabric, the thing being made, and reframing is the closest thing we have to a sense of making of this documentary on the evolution of our consciousness. And reframing is therefore the felting of the fabric of consciousness in action. And it's also the process of reframing where the previously invisible gets made visible. So I've been obsessed since I could read and write with the phenomenon of information transmission. And there's this idea from Marshall McLuhan that the medium is the message, which always makes me think of the semantic session we did on consent with Alex Aldridge, who is a sex on drugs and consent researcher. And she researches and collects empirical data on all of the ways that consent is used enacted in nightlife, and all of the different ways that people are having sex on drugs. And she uses this to try to create safer nightlife culture. And in the session where we were speaking with Alex, we talked about an irony, because we also had Britta Love there as well, who's a restorative justice circle keeper and a sex workers' rights activist. And Britta had just been talking about Betty Martin's wheel of consent, which, if you like, is one of these spinning wheels that spins invisible things into visibility so that they can be discussed in discourse and in our lived understanding of how we approach these topics. But when Alex moonlights as a nightlife safety officer in parties with playrooms, the way consent is worded when there's really heavy techno and no scope for speech and it's a dark room, comes down to what you can fit on a piece of A4 paper that gets stuck on a wall. This is the available medium through which to convey the message. Consent is key, and its transmission relies on the remediation that automatically happens when you engage with any form of media, the remediation that you're doing right now as you listen to this talk. It relies on people who receive the message activating the conceptualization of consent that they already have in their heads. And so the best possible use of media in this context is this short message, because any more words would dilute it. But it's absolutely essential that when you have a short message like this, it's in cahoots, it's in collaboration with all of the kinds of work that Britta and Alex are doing the rest of the time. Because if we don't keep updating the linguistic systems on which we process these kinds of topics, then we're going to reliably keep living in the systems that produce these non-consensual experiences in the first place. And the struggle to work out what words to wield with a Sharpie in such limited space instinctively reminded me of the process of passing notes in school. So you'd tacitly rip off a corner of your exercise book and it would be whatever size it was. And then part of the fun, I was quite a fastidious child, was making the message fit, which might mean using whatever nib produced the thinnest writing, or choosing a smaller word to flick into your mate's pencil case. And in terms of concision, I suppose this makes passing notes a kind of preschool precursor to Twitter. But it's also most people's first brush with information transmission, creating news, and obviously that lit a fire in the handful of people around the world who beefed up into media moguls when they grew up. But I'm just going to skip to the next slide now because we don't have much time. I think it's important to think about what Shakespeare has to tell us about media. And you might think, why would we look to Shakespeare to think about what's going on in media today? Well, the extent to which you reread old texts actually has a tremendous impact on who you are and how you feel, and the stories that you tell yourself, and ultimately who you are. And in Shakespeare, your party is a member of the audience to the onstage deaths, which result from the doctoring of a narrative as it changes hands throughout the play. And so you see the consequences of misinformation absorbed in real time as this plays out. And this is exactly what doesn't happen in our lived experience today as consumers of today's mainstream media. The seeds of stories are sown, not a material metaphor this time, and cultivated over months. The methods of transmission are laser focused on imparting an attitudinal stance and lulling us into a mode of passive absorption. And mainstream media is engineered to make sure you're not thinking critically, and it's written in generally 10th grade English level in the US, and the salient teachings reiterated again. And to aid this absorption, all of these things are training your attention on the things that mean that you will forget the other things, all of the things that we have been talking about today. And so it's with all of this in mind that I just ask you, when you share something, think about why you're sharing it. Do you want to use the hashtag? Do you believe in the hashtag? Are you, in fact, by potentially adopting a call for drug policy reform, for rescheduling for medicinal purposes, are you being silenced from actually doing what your heart says, which is to call from decriminalization because one is subsuming the other? Have a think about everything that is the background to what you're sharing with a piece of media, because the afterlife of all media that we consume, when we share it, when we tell people about it, when we decide to hide it from our feeds, that's in our hands. So it's in your hands, and it's in your power to achieve emancipation from perpetuating narratives that, in fact, we will have the power to change.